They did not come to conquer Earth's oceans. They came to file them under an inventory code and move on to the next planet on the list. The Coordinate Compact's universal hydrological assessment did not mention war or weapons or even negotiation. It mentioned tonnage. Humanity's oceans, 361 million square kilometers of them, had been logged as an undeveloped asset pending collection, the way a landlord logs an empty storage unit. The communique arrived translated into flawless English, which was itself the first insult, because the compact had not bothered to ask whether humanity wanted to be understood so precisely. Classification: unclaimed hydrological resource. Development status: negligible. Extraction status: authorized upon standard notice. 3 sentences, no greeting, no signature beyond a seal shaped like a closed valve. Within 9 hours, probes began surfacing in the Pacific, the Atlantic, the shallow black trench off Guam. Each one carried a single band of orange paint around its collar, stenciled with a phrase the compact's translators had rendered with total devastating politeness: an sentient asset pending extraction. The probes themselves were small, almost apologetic in design, no larger than a weather buoy, because the compact had not considered Earth's oceans worth the expense of a larger survey platform. Someone photographed a buoy off the coast of Chile with the marking clearly visible, and the image went everywhere in under a day. Because there is nothing that spreads faster than a species discovering it has been filed under disposable. The diplomat who came to explain it in person called himself Threl Vantik, Undersecretary for Peripheral Resource Reclamation, and he smiled the entire time he did it. He spoke without notes, in the unhurried cadence of someone who had delivered the same speech to 11 other species and expected the 12th to go the same way. Your world has had, he said, 4 billion years of liquid water, and you have used it to move ships across its surface. We intend no cruelty in saying this is underdevelopment. It is simply accurate. The room did not answer him with outrage. It answered him with silence, the specific kind that happens when a species is doing arithmetic instead of feeling insulted. Vantik seemed to take the silence as agreement, and continued, almost gently, listing the other worlds the compact had processed under the same classification. Worlds whose oceans, lakes, and subsurface ice had all been logged, collected, and repurposed elsewhere without incident, without protest. And he noted, without any of them losing anything they had actually been using. Dr. Amara Voss, senior hydrographer for the Joint Oceanic Monitoring Office, was the only person in the delegation who did not look at the floor. She had spent 19 years being told that deep ocean systems were a lower research priority than orbital defense, watching funding for seafloor mapping shrink year over year while budgets for anything that pointed upward only grew. And she recognized, in Vantik's total confidence, the specific shape of someone who had not checked his own assumptions. "Does that include Earth's oceans?" she asked. It was meant as a challenge, the kind of question you ask a man who has just told you your whole planet is empty storage, expecting him to backpedal or clarify some exemption you hadn't thought of. Vantik did not backpedal. "Naturally," he said, "every drop, surface, subsurface, and whatever you have below your ice caps that you have not yet mapped." He said it kindly, the way you'd confirm a minor detail to someone who clearly hadn't understood the scope of their own loss. She regretted asking because the confirmation started a clock. Standard notice under compact law was 72 hours. After that, extraction vessels would begin drawing water directly from the ocean floor, and there would be no forum, no appeal, and no second communique. Then Voss did the thing that made her, eventually, the only person in the room the history books would bother to name. She sat with the 72 hours for exactly 4 seconds, and then she said quietly to no one in particular, "Good. Then he doesn't know what's actually down there." It was not a rallying line. Nobody around her stood up or cheered. It was the kind of sentence a scientist says right before she starts making calls, because she has just realized that the people threatening to take something have never actually looked at it. She made 3 calls. The first went to Dr. Kyan Bonsu, a hydrothermal chemist who had spent the better part of a decade defending a paper arguing that deep vent ecosystems processed dissolved minerals at a rate 3 orders of magnitude higher than any model predicted. A claim 2 separate journals had rejected as implausible before a third one, grudgingly, printed it. Bonsu, who introduced himself to every new colleague by explaining, unprompted, that his name meant nothing to do with bonsai trees. No relation, entirely different continent, arrived at the extraction survey site already annoyed, because he had read the compact's technical spec sheet on the flight over. He went quiet the moment he pulled up the actual composition data from the hydrothermal fields near the extraction zones, because the numbers told him something the compact clearly hadn't checked. The compact's own survey documentation, leaked into the shared technical packet along with the extraction notice, described the target water column as a homogeneous fluid medium. A single averaged value for salinity and mineral content that might have been accurate for a still lake somewhere on the compact's own homeworld, but bore no relationship to a column of water descending 3 kilometers past an active spreading ridge, where superheated fluid rich in dissolved metal sulfides met near-freezing seawater and produced a chemical environment closer to a slow-motion furnace than to anything a household intake pipe was built to survive. Their intake arrays are calibrated for what they call standard liquid, he said finally, still staring at the readout. Undifferentiated, clean, that's not what's down there. Vent water at 3,000 meters is carrying particulate sulfide density high enough to abrade an unshielded filtration mesh in under 6 hours. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. They built a straw for drinking water. We have acid rivers running through solid rock. The second call went to Dr. Myril Nair, a marine bioacoustics engineer who had once been quietly removed from a defense advisory panel for insisting, in writing, that humpback whale vocalization patterns contained structural information dense enough to interfere with sonar-based mapping systems. An idea the panel chair had called, in front of her, a waste of the meeting's time. Nair, who had adopted the habit, after that meeting, of introducing her research with the phrase, "The waste of your time is about to save your life," which had stopped being a joke roughly the 3rd time it turned out to be literally true, spent 6 hours inside the extraction survey data before she found what she was looking for. The compact scanning arrays, she explained, mapped ocean volume by listening for a baseline of ambient acoustic noise and filtering everything above it as interference to be ignored. A design choice that made perfect sense for a species surveying dead or empty oceans on worlds where nothing had ever evolved a reason to sing, and made almost no sense at all applied to a planet that had spent 500 million years filling its water with sound on purpose. They had never accounted for a planet where the interference was, itself, structured, layered, and in places deliberately repetitive across distances of thousands of kilometers, the way a species with no other means of long-range contact might build a signal built to travel. Blue whale calls at 19 Hz, sperm whale click trains spaced with a precision that no natural noise floor could replicate, the layered chorus of a coral reef at dusk rising and falling on a schedule tied to the setting sun. All of it sat directly inside the frequency band the arrays used to triangulate open water. Their filters throw away exactly the part of the signal we can control, she said. We're not hiding from their sensors. We're the static they've been trained to ignore, and static can be shaped. The third call went to Dr. Jinwoo Park, a physical oceanographer whose thermohaline circulation models had been publicly dismissed for years as too granular to be useful. A criticism that had not stopped him from refining them anyway alone on a departmental budget that barely covered server time. Park, no relation to any other Park working in oceanography, a fact he mentioned exactly once and then never again, because apparently once was enough, ran the extraction zone coordinates against 4 decades of current data and sat back from his monitor because the pattern in front of him was, for the first time in his career, going to matter to someone. Every one of their intended extraction points sits on a predictable upwelling corridor, he said. Cold, dense, mineral-heavy water rising on a schedule I can model to within an hour. If we know exactly when and where the deep water surface is, we know exactly when and where their siphons will be under the worst possible load. The models themselves were nothing exotic, decades of buoy data and satellite altimetry and current meter readings that had been sitting in public archives the entire time, unglamorous and unfunded. And until this exact moment, unimportant to anyone but Park and the handful of colleagues who still returned his emails. What made them dangerous now was not the data. It was the fact that the Compact, for all its survey probes and translated communiques, had never once thought to ask a planet how its water actually moved before deciding to take it. He did not sit on the floor. He simply stopped talking for a moment because he had just realized that the ocean itself was about to become the only weapon Earth needed. Voss listened to all 3 reports inside 18 hours because she had insisted from the start that the teams run in parallel, not in sequence. What emerged was not a plan to fight the extraction fleet. It was a plan to let the ocean do what it had always done. On a schedule the Compact had never bothered to learn, at a moment its equipment would be least prepared to survive it. Nobody called it a weapon, because none of them had built anything. They had only finally been asked to explain what they already knew. The Compact noticed the survey teams working the coordinates before the 72 hours were up, and Vantik's tone changed for the first time. His second communique dropped the pleasantries entirely, arriving without the ornamental greeting that had opened every previous transmission, without the seal shaped like a closed valve, stripped down to the kind of blunt procedural language a bureaucracy reaches for only when it senses, for the first time, that the timeline it wrote for someone else might not survive contact with reality. Unauthorized interference with a pending asset constitutes a material breach, it read. The compact will accelerate collection to 18 hours from receipt of this notice, and any further activity in the designated zones will be treated as hostile. It was shorter than the first message, and colder because a species that prides itself on patience does not enjoy discovering it has been outpaced. Voss did not slow down. She moved the deployment window up to match the new deadline, because 18 hours was, as it happened, almost exactly the length of the next predicted upwelling cycle at the primary extraction site. The compact fleet arrived on schedule. 14 extraction vessels, low and wide-bodied, each one trailing a siphon array the length of a container ship, descending toward the coordinates Park had modeled 6 days earlier. Satellite imagery caught them in formation an hour before contact, holding a precise, almost ceremonial spacing above the target zone, the kind of formation a species uses when it does not expect resistance and has stopped bothering to plan for it. They deployed in formation. The arrays unfolded. The first intake cycle began exactly on time. 90 seconds later, the upwelling hit. Cold water surged up from 3,000 meters, carrying particulate sulfide density. Bonsu had clocked at 9 times the array's tolerance. 6 siphons clogged within the first 2 minutes. Filtration meshes built for clean fluid seized under the mineral grit. Warning systems meant for mechanical failure lit up in sequence across 6 hulls, because none of them had been built to flag a chemical assault. Nayer's shaped acoustic field went active a heartbeat later. Whale calls and reef noise layered directly into the frequency band the compact used to hold formation. 4 vessels lost position lock. Their navigation systems reported open water where 2 other hulls were already sitting, and they drifted toward each other anyway. 1 ship adapted. Its captain rerouted power to a secondary filtration bank and held position through the worst of the surge, the only vessel in the fleet to do so. Voss let that one alone, because there was no reason to punish competence. 11 minutes and 40 seconds after the upwelling began, 9 of the 14 vessels had disengaged and were climbing out of the extraction zone. 3 more followed within the hour, trailing damaged siphon arrays they would need weeks to repair. No weapon had been fired. No hull had been breached. The ocean had simply done, on schedule, what oceans do, and the compact's equipment had not been built to survive it. Threll Vantik's official response arrived 4 hours later, and it was predictably bureaucratic. Formal protest. Reservation of rights. A demand for compensation for equipment losses that the compact's own treaty language, ironically, did not actually support. His personal transmission arrived a day after that, unscheduled, unofficial, and considerably shorter. There was a pause before he spoke, long enough that Voss almost thought the connection had failed. "I called your oceans undeveloped," he said finally, "because nothing about them had been shaped in the way we understand shaping. I did not account for a world where nothing needed to be built, because everything necessary was already moving, and had been moving for longer than my species has kept records." Another pause. "That was audacious of you, to let the water fight for you and call it a coincidence." Voss did not respond to the apology directly. She was already 3 screens deep into Bonsu's vent chemistry data, cross-referencing it against 6 other star systems' hydrothermal signatures that the compact's own probes had unintentionally logged and left behind during the survey, sitting untouched in a data packet nobody on the compact side had thought worth encrypting, because nobody on the compact side had imagined a planet capable of reading it back. "Tell him," she said to the communications officer beside her, not looking up, "that if the compact wants to know what an actual mineral extraction partnership looks like, Dr. Bonsu has some corrections to their intake specs. We'll want access to their deep field survey data in exchange." She paused, then added, mostly to herself, "I've had 4 days to think about the next 6 months. I'm not stopping now." Bonsu was already drafting the corrections. Nayer had started building a catalog of every acoustic signature the compact's arrays had ever mistaken for noise, on the theory that a species willing to listen properly might finally be worth talking to. Park had not stopped modeling currents at all, because the upwelling schedule for the next extraction window, should the compact be foolish enough to request one, was already sitting open on his second monitor. Outside, the extraction buoys were still bobbing gently in the Pacific swell, their orange collars catching the light, pending nothing at all. Pending nothing at all.